And so if you're here, welcome. What I'll also say is if there's a question that comes up, feel free to ask. Um, if I need to slow down and clarify something, feel free to chime in. And at the end of the day, the hope is that you all leave with something that's going to inform whatever reason you're here, whether it's your own children or work that you do with children in whatever manner. And so the best of the day, you retain about 20 or 30% of what you hear. But I can assure you that if you're interested in something and you have a question or a thought that ends up being answered, that you'll leave with that. And if it's going to benefit you in some way, feel free to ask. Okay. And this is a four-part series. We're actually on session two, but I tend to review things slightly each time because I just think there are certain elements of this that are just foundational. And so this sort of past the positive session, the takeaway will be something around our brains accumulate data, and in particular, experiential or emotional data. And past the positive is a practice that I think is one that's easily implemented that we could leave with that has big bang for the buck, so to speak. Okay. And so, just a real quick recap, anxiety has a purpose. And what I say is, we're all on a spectrum of anxiety. And so, if your alarm clock goes off in the morning and you have somewhere to be, that's the stress chemical or cortisol that starts initiating to get you motivated to take care of whatever you need to take care of and get out the door. Okay. So, anxiety is not all bad. If it's reached a point to where it becomes beyond what a typical norm would be, and I'll show some stress scales here in a little bit, then the impacts of that on the developing brain is it actually starts to create stunts, not only anatomically, but also socially and emotionally, that you'll see in children overall, but especially in environments like school and so on, where you get a lot of kids together. Okay. And then the flip side of anxiety, stress, toxic stress, or even the far end, which would be trauma, would be having really good protective factors in place. And the formula is, even if there are stressors that occur, if you have really good protective factors in place, then that really is the formula towards resilience. Okay. And so just setting the context a little bit with the objectives from that. So here's a thought that comes in and makes no connection to anything. So I show this slide to just say I'm not going to talk at you all because information will go in one ear and out the other. What the hope is that you all bring your experiences and expertise, which would be in this upper right hand corner, and take whatever you've learned here today and make an attachment so that it's applicable in some way. Okay. So anything you hear new is sort of this neuron or pathway that's connecting to existing information. The hope is that you leave here with something that you can apply, or something that you could share to the benefit of whatever your practices are, and then to the benefit of others. Okay. And we're more likely to do that if we're interactive. All right. So I've talked some about this. Anxiety is not all bad if recognized and managed properly, which would be the practice side of this. And here are stress scales. Okay. So the optimal zone would be really right here on the left. All right. You're never at level zero of anxiety because your brain is always in an anticipation state in some way. All right. And like I said, when you wake up in the morning, if you have a deadline of some sort, if you're a child that has homework due, or enrichment or a sports game, motivation sits in this 0 to 4 to some extent. Okay. And so there's an optimal zone for that. If you don't have enough of that, then that's where you may be missing deadlines, you're not motivated, and so on. So the challenge is, over time, you know, if you experience setbacks or adversities or lack of successes in some way, then that brain, that biology, and then the collective experience of those may start taking you up this stress scale to some extent. Okay. And what you don't want is, you don't want to end up as a child, especially ticking up the stress scale, because wherever you end up spending the predominant amount of time is where your body and brain is going to try to wire you to. All right. So I work also with emergency responders, Seattle Police Department, fire, Las Vegas Metro PD coming out of that large shooting. So I'm saying that just to frame in to what extent our bodies utilize anxiety or stress and how it manifests itself. And, the series is on resilience, but what we found is without adversity in some way or having something to bounce back from, resilience is more challenging to build. Okay. So adversity or setbacks aren't like a dead end in some way, especially for developing children. It's an opportunity to bounce back from something that has them stronger or gives them the ability that when they run into that again, that they're not afraid of it. They could take on that challenge and be successful. But much of that is being able to modulate and regulate the stress response right here. Okay. And so this would be a stress response. All right. And what's happening here is this baby needs something in particular to calm them down and get out of that limbic system into that frontal lobe. And the number one protective factor is really people. So caring, trusting relationships and people. So when somebody responds to this child, it calms them down and gives them a repetition in their frontal lobe. And our emotional state really is on a range. All right. There are some days for most of us, and it's just part of the human experience, to where some days are better than others. And our emotional state on some days is better than others. What we have going on by nurture and in our environment in our life puts us in a position to be at different places on this. Two things. We want to be able to have recognition of what puts us closer to the range of ideal for ourselves. Because if we can do that, we're going to be a more effective parent, teacher, partner, coworker, and so on. And if you can have recognition of that, then you can develop practices like in moments of stress, I use the term a manual reset, to where you're entering into that meeting or you're running into whatever that adverse moment might be. You take those few breaths to reset that parasympathetic nervous system and to be able to reset that system to be closer to this ideal range here. Okay. But that starts with recognition. Now, I'm saying that in terms of adults in practice, but I would say that is also something that you want to teach children as young as possible. Okay. And even in things as small as like test anxiety, having a manual reset in some way to just calm that emotional state down impacts things as small as that, even as little as that may seem. Right. And so our emotional states on a range, it's just part of the human condition, doesn't make anything wrong with us. It's just part of how humans experience things as they move forward in life. Okay. So we go from here to here to some extent. And a day like this, we want to take science and make that digestible and applicable in some way. And much of the research that I've done is based on this. There's an acronym ACEs, which is the short version of adverse childhood experiences. And I'm talking about this because I said earlier, without adversity, it's much more challenging to develop resilience. And the majority of my time was really built in the research world around understanding this being what some people believe is probably the most impactful research study on development as well as health and lifespan that's ever existed. It originated in San Diego. A woman by the name of Laura Porter, who oversees a body of work called Neuroscience, Neurological Epigenetic Adversity Resilience, brought the original researchers up, Dr. Anda and Folletti. I was called down into a meeting in Olympia, and what they were telling me was they want somebody to be able to really research this in schools because that's where kids are spending most of the time, and that person ended up being me. So if we were to review this, here would be those 10 original adverse childhood experiences. Okay. And most of this research at this point has occurred in our state, primarily in our Seattle region, a lot of this being in Seattle public schools for those number of years. But if you look up here, the breaking point on these would be 3 or 4. Okay. And what that says is once you reach 3, 4, 5, 6 of these, there's significant neurological, biological impacts that come as a byproduct of this, right? Now, I will say too, at organizations like Rainier Scholars or other places I've been to really research this adversity and putting into place protective factors, what we found is I have met kids that have experienced 10 ACEs, but when they have protective factors around them that are highly plentiful, they end up being very strong people that really don't wither at anything that comes their way in life. Okay. What the research also says is if you have 0 of these, it could be a detriment. Okay, so my question you could just answer real quick in the chat. As undesirable as experiencing these things would be, why might research show that if you have 0 of these, that it could actually be detrimental in some way? Okay, whatever your idea is, maybe put it in the chat really quick. I'm wondering your thoughts on that, because we're not hoping for children in development to be experiencing ACEs. But having studied this now for over 10 years, it is showing that if you have 0 of these, it could have an unideal impact in some way. Why might that be? No skills developed to navigate outside world experiences, no exposure to any stress, they're not trained on how to respond. Okay. Perhaps experiencing one builds resilience. Okay. Yeah, and so what I would say to that is when I look up here, one of the adverse experiences or ACEs I had was a loss of a parent or a caregiver at age 15. Okay, losing my father. Okay, and so that would be pretty significant. I've been impacted by probably 3 of these, but I was fortunate enough to have good protective factors around. Child is not able to lean on experience to face adversity. Okay, good. So when I think back, my father passed away on a Monday. And what I tell people is I was at school by Wednesday. All right. When I got to school, everybody was pretty surprised to see me there. And when I think back on that and all that I've learned now and all the research and teaching that I've done, the reason why I ended up going to school on Wednesday is it didn't feel good day to day to just sitting and be grieving. Okay. I still grieved, but there was something about the routines of school that had me just want to be in that routine, and because of that routine feel better in the midst of something that was very adverse. Okay, so here would be a practice that I would say out there in whatever environment we're thinking of, school, after school program, or home. One things kids need significantly is consistency and predictability. Okay, and the science behind that is our brains really like patterns. And if our brains aren't caught off guard by what's coming next, that's lowering that stress response. And for kids, if we're talking about even things as to the extent of behaviors, the lower that stress level is on those stress scales, the less challenging behaviors you're going to experience. Okay. And the reason why is twofold. You're going to have a nervous system that's not ignited to just quickly react. And the other piece of that is if you're lower on that stress scale, you're going to have more of an ability to recognize an emotion and regulate it. All right. So consistency and predictability at its baseline does that. What I tell adults is if you have an important meeting to get to that starts at 8 a.m. and you check the ETA on your phone to get there, but your ETA is incorrect and you're running into detours, there happened to be a collision, during that drive, the more of those inconsistencies that you didn't think about ahead of time and your phone didn't tell you, the more of those you run into, the higher you'll be ticking on that stress scale. Okay. So real practice for kids in whatever environment is, how consistent and predictable is it to where we know what's coming next? Right. And what these ACEs does is it's thrown lots of inconsistency into somebody's life. Right. The flip side of the ACE, some of the symptoms of ACEs that we found out were things like this. And that's why I'd say not only is it the most impactful research study, at least named in human development, but also in lifespan because of the broader impacts on things like this. Okay. All right. Any questions about that? Because what I say is if you're going to speak about resilience, you got to understand the flip side of resilience, which is adversity. And the sort of biggest body of work that speaks to adversity would be ACEs. All right. This and adverse childhood experiences, if it is especially these categories of neglect, neglect is much more challenging to interrupt because it's not as tangible to see or recognize, and a child may not have the same ability to articulate it. It's much more harder to interrupt. Something like neglect would fall under complex trauma, where something that's more tangible that you can recognize would be simple trauma. And those would be your two categories of trauma. So really quick, if I were to ask, now each of these are harmful, but if what research says is one of these categories long term has much more risk involved with it. Okay, so you have these more tangible, recognizable events, or you have these less tangible, harder to recognize, harder to communicate, ongoing phenomena. In the chat, which one would you say? They're all harmful, but which would we say may have more long-term risk to continue to harm somebody? This more tangible category of abuse or neglect. What are your thoughts on that? I'm seeing the tangible abuses. All right, abuse. Yeah, I have this slide that shows two brain images side by age 3, and they end up looking significantly different. And it's actually tied to this, but I didn't put it in here. Um, so long term, what research shows is more long term risk is associated with neglect. Okay. Does anybody have any idea why? And again, it's not as if any of these are more favorable than others, but long term research shows that there's more ongoing risk with neglect than there is with these more tangible abuses. Does anybody have any idea why research shows that? My guess is that abuse is a connection. All right. Then somebody said, can you give an example of neglect? Okay. So an example would be when, if you're back to that baby that's crying, all right, when that baby is crying, you have a region of your brain that's firing off, and that baby really doesn't know anything yet. You don't have enough density in that brain, which is why we don't have memories age 0 to 2 3ish. We don't have enough density in that brain yet to remember things. Those regions are still developing, so specifically your hippocampus. So when you're crying, you have an amygdala or limbic system, which is also where fight, flight, react, fawn, freeze sits. That's firing off when you're stressed as a baby, wanting to be fed, changed, or the other thing would be held. Okay. So when that's firing off and somebody shows up, picks you up, and comforts you, it calms that region down and it gives you a repetition in your frontal lobe. And I want you to think of your frontal lobe as your region of your brain that's more fully developed by age 25 through 29, which is why your car insurance goes down. Okay. So that repetition or development in that frontal lobe comes from somebody loving you, caring about you, and nurturing you day to day to day, multiple times of a day. And then that's just stacking up, but that's having a huge anatomical impact on that brain, anatomical and neurological. If you're a baby that's not getting that, that would already fall in the category of neglect. Okay. So I think the difference is each of those are harmful, but no one would recognize that that's occurring in some way. And so, there's a chemical called oxytocin, which comes from attachment. That chemical of being nurtured and loved and attached in somebody actually reduces that cortisol. So if you remove that from somebody while in development and that falls under the neglect category, that's much more challenging to recognize and intervene on than it is if you have a child that's regurgitating a story of abuse. So it's not as if, one is less impactful than the other on a day. It's that the neglect is much more challenging to recognize and it could go on for years. And those years of that going on is causing damage. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? All right. Which will contribute to some of the practices that I'll talk about that are small collective things that could go a long way. All right. All right, something in the chat. Okay, so it's a double whammy because the neglect is neglected. Very much so. It's a double whammy. And if I were doing a straight up trauma training, what I'd be saying is your formula for how trauma impacts you is you have repetition. So the more times you experience something, that's making an impact. Okay. And then you have a time frame. So let's say I get in a car accident one time. That's not as impactful if I get in a car accident 10 times. Right. So the repetition of that 10 times is much more traumatic. But if I get in 10 car accidents in 100 years, that's less impactful than if I get in 10 car accidents in 1 year. So your formula is repetition and then time and then the intensity of something that you experience. So if it's neglect that you can't interrupt, and we say that could go on for 15 to 20 years, that's very significant as opposed to little David who tells a story that somebody can intervene and help me on. All right. All right. Does that make sense? And like I said, none of them are ideal, but that's the way these things sort of shake out. Okay. Any questions about that beyond the ones in the chat? All right. So if you go back to my story, showing up to school on a Wednesday, and what you see up here is a lot of that research we were doing in school shows that 1/3 of our classrooms in Washington State have kids that are beyond that number 3 or 4 breaking point for ACEs, which was alarming at the time, which is why, a lot of districts ended up doing lots of staff training and so on for a number of years, especially prior to the pandemic. It looks like schools are wanting to get back to that. But 1/3 of a typical classroom had kids past that breaking point. All right. So you've got a 15-year-old David who's doing this presentation that loses a parent. That's an adverse childhood experience and an ACE, but I show up to school on Wednesday because it's a consistent, predictable place. All right. So consistency and predictability is a practice. Here's the other thing that environment represented. Okay. I had teachers that cared about me. Many of them who came to my house that Monday evening to check on me. And I wanted to be around people that I felt like cared about me. All right. So a real practice was being around good people that cared about me. I had a group of friends that were a good group of friends that supported me. I had sports practice after school that I didn't want to miss. I had my teammates, I had my coaches, and all of those things that I just laid out, those 6, 7, or 8 things, those would be protective factors that buffered the one traumatic event. Okay. So here would be a quick question, and you could just answer it in the chat. What do you think sticks with you more intently, a negative experience or a positive experience? because I named one significant trauma and then I laid out about 8 things that I needed to sort of buffer that. My mom held it together. Okay, that'd be number 9. Yeah, what sticks you would be more positive or negative? Okay, I'm seeing in the chat negative. Okay, yeah, so negative sticks with you more intently. And so it's not an even 1-to-1. Day to day, you want consistency and predictability. So that's a real practice. The brain knows what's coming next, so it's more relaxed. You got to have relationships. Okay, the counter to some of this is every kid needs an adult that thinks the world of them in some way. Okay, so that's a real practice. I'm gonna talk about real sort of tangible things you do, but we've got to take care of tier one Maslow pyramid as well to build resilience. But I've got consistency and I've got people that care about me. All right. Any questions about ACEs? All right. Where things evolve beyond ACEs, I'm not going to read all these, but these would be causes of toxic stress or causes of complex trauma. Something that was pretty alarming that came up in about 2018. So you see my name and a gentleman, Scott Hanauer, that were researching this, was this term here, perfectionism. Okay, first off, does anybody have any idea what perfectionism might mean, and why would it show up in a research study trying to find causes of toxic stress? And this would be a drill down on ACEs. But does anybody have any idea what perfectionism might mean and why it might show up on a cause of toxic stress? And I've worked with all different types of schools all over the country. Some schools that have very high tuitions, and you think that those kids and everybody have everything made. And I can tell you something I see in many of those environments is this perfectionism here. Okay. Social media never being enough. Okay, pressure to succeed. Okay. All right, good. So yeah, so perfect doesn't exist. Trying to obtain an impossible goal. Yeah, perfect doesn't exist. And so what I tell people is, but that kid is doing pretty darn good. But if there hasn't been enough feedback that past the positive that informs them that they're doing pretty darn good, they could be questioning how good they're doing. Okay. And something like cognitive behavioral therapy, what that's to do is to really understand somebody's thoughts and their perceptions. And if you could change a thought or a perception, it could change a behavior or an action. The perception for many of these kids experiencing perfectionism is that they're just not good enough, and no matter what it is. All right. The challenge is perfect doesn't exist. So pretty darn good. Many of them much better than I did in school at the time. And perfect, that gap between pretty darn good and perfect causes an elevated stress response on that stress scale. And if you put that kid side by side with a kid living in a community of violence and remove all variables, but just look at the stress and look how that brain is firing off. They're firing off exactly the same. Okay. And so that's why that would show up on something like this. Okay. All right. So again, I won't read all of these, but these would be a drill down of adversities that are beyond just ACEs. So the impacts of that. I talked some about this in the first session, but this is development and this is maturity. So you're 25, your car insurance goes down, and there's a belief that this frontal lobe now is a fully functioning, processing, thinking adult. All right. But what stress does is it actually negatively impacts the development of this, because the stressed brain, even us as babies, as infants crying, is firing off from this red region here. And our brain's like a muscle. Whatever's going to get exercised the most is what's going to develop. So something like neglect, if neglect is occurring day to day without relief, then this red region here is getting lots of stimulation. The risk is our slowed down processing and thinking region of our brain is not partnering well with our stressed, ready to react, freeze, flight, whatever it is part of our brain. and whichever one has received more stimulation is going to win out in that. And now you've got a kid knocking a water bottle off a table or so on when they're frustrated. All right. So ultimately, you need both of these regions working together. All right. So consistency and predictability is promoting that frontal lobe. You have adults that are caring about a child and communicating that to them. It's promoting that frontal lobe. Teachers ask me, David, what is the quickest, easy to do practice that we could do on a given day? And what I've said is if you catch a child doing something well, name it and let them know. I wouldn't make up stuff, but if you can name that a child did something well with evidence, what I say is you might not remember that 2 or 3 minutes later, but that child might be thinking about that into the night. Okay. The other piece of that is they're more likely to repeat it. And so if you do that enough times, you may be replacing a maladaptive or unideal behavior by promoting the one that they've taken a chance on that have done well. Okay. All of those small collective things that are doable are promoting the development of this frontal lobe and not an overdevelopment of this amygdala region here. Okay. The other piece of this would be our number one cause for a misdiagnosis of ADHD. All right. All right. So anybody know what this is? It kind of says it at the top, but what would be the purpose of me showing something like this, do you think? And I can tell you, I walk around UW and people say, David, why do you still refer to these things that should be in a museum? And I go, you know what? They're digestible. And I think from what I've seen, people still appreciate it. So you got this version that's fancier than this version. But what would be the purpose of me showing something like this, do you think? So self-actualization is really just are the conditions in place for somebody to become the best version of themselves and whatever that is. And so the challenge is if you don't have some of these basics in place, a child in development may take reach to get them taken care of. Okay. So do you think that there is a child, adolescent, or teenager somewhere that ended up joining an antisocial peer group? Okay. But the reason they're doing that is out of the perception of they want to belong and feel like they're cared about somewhere. Do we think that's ever existed in history? That this kid joined a group of some type, and it's a group that gets in trouble. It could be a gang somewhere, whatever it is. And that kid's actually a good kid. But what they perceive they're missing is the experience of being cared about or belonging or loved in some way. Okay. What I'm seeing is in the chat is yes. Okay. All right. So if you're thinking about home and you're thinking about school or you're thinking about I work at an organization with kids, here would be your baseline. So a lot of research I do is on school climate and what I'm assessing for, especially this time early in the year, so you could still take action is do kids feel safe and do they belong at school with very simple quantitative questions that point you in the direction of something that you can do. Okay. All right. And then these other anchor points. We got to feel safe. Our brain is always in a state of anticipation. The more consistent, predictable things are, relationships in place, I know what's coming next. People care about me, so I feel emotionally safe. Safety trumps everything. It could be a bright, sunny, pleasant day. If something dangerous shows itself, that frontal lobe will shut down, that amygdala will take off, and then we'll flee or whatever it is. Okay. The other thing would be attachment. Okay, attachment is vital. I described that all the way to when we're that baby crying and we don't know anything else. Somebody responding, nurturing, comforting us it's increasing oxytocin, lowering cortisol, clicking our frontal lobe on, giving our amygdala a break. Okay, so attachment. Where you see challenges, many kids that are in the foster care system that don't feel like they've ever been genuinely attached to people. They've had people that care, they don't trust it. There's something called reactive attachment where they'll actually push people away. All right. And it's not because they're a bad person. It's because they'd rather lose people on their terms than not feel like they're good enough or people abandon them. So that's how significant that is. All right. Nourishment. Nourishment could be our day-to-day needs. Our brain's not our biggest organ, but it does burn about 20% of your caloric burn just running everything. So nourishment in that way, but also like, are my interests being met? Am I developing and growing in various ways? Which lends itself to number four, which would be esteem and successes. Okay. Kids are in development. Kids by nature are pretty insecure by nature because they haven't landed on who they are. And in these stages of development, they're put in so many situations of comparison that sort of past the positive, letting that child they did something well is taking care of this number four in some ways. What you also do is you'll minimize kids shooting for attention because when there's opportunities to give it in the positive, you'll be doing that, which will minimize that unideal ways of trying to get attention in some way. Okay. So just anchoring us in some of the research that's out there. Okay. I'm not going to read all this to you, but when I talk about development, what I tend to go to is Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. Okay, I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but the reason why I like it is it gives you some framing for, and if you tie a child who's resilient versus not resilient, in some ways you can also parallel that with the way that he's laid out these stages. So if you, in these 0 to 18 months, what you're hoping to resolve is children develop a sense of trust with caregivers by receiving care and affection. Okay, reliability, that would be your consistency. If that is resolved, the child lands on this side of the equation, which would be trust. Already, that's a more resilient child. Okay. As opposed to questioning, am I worthy? Do people care about me? You're already further back from resilience. And the way this works is once you resolve one stage, it sets you up to move on to the other. So what you see this bracket for is these would be our childhood stages. And so I don't know what age of children that many of you have, or if you're working with kids, what age group that is. But these would be a reference point. You're trying to land children on the plus side of this. And what I believe is the plus side of these things parallel with being more resilient. Okay, 1 to 12. Okay. Yeah, industry versus inferiority would be that later stage of adolescence. Kids being able to cope with new social and academic demands. Success leads to a sense of competence, while failure results in a feeling of inferiority. All right, I'm going to talk about that one for a second. The 6 to 11, naming those successes, scaffolding a child in areas where they need more support, moving them towards success. If that occurs and this child lands on an intrinsic sense of competence, do you believe that'll show up in that child's behaviors? We have scaffolded that child towards growing in areas that they weren't as good, and now they feel better. We've given them feedback that they're doing great in an area. We're saying, great job, David, on that math test. I knew you could do it. And now I'm walking in the world feeling competent and confident. Do we think that shows up in my thinking and behavior? As opposed to always questioning that, feeling like there could be a perception of failure. All right, definitely, yes. Okay. Yeah, so if we just take that snapshot right there of 6 to 11, if that child doesn't land on that side of competence because they haven't experienced or received that feedback, what I've seen is as that child approaches teenage years, they will stop taking on challenges or avoid things that might be more challenging out of fear of failure. And why I mention that is the child that lands on the side of competence they're more likely to take on those new challenges. Those would be early signs of resilience already. And what you're seeing is a lot of the root of that comes from the messages and the experiences that they've received primarily from adults. Okay. All right, so this may be a reference point. Any questions about this? All right, so we develop from totally dependent, that baby that can't do anything for ourselves, into hoping that we're navigating college, the workplace, or whatever else. And usually the color coding I use is green is ideal and red is non-ideal. So the hope is in these developmental years, we've got much more green than red. All right, and it takes that. And so here would be another practice. Okay. Well, first off, here would be an example of resilience. So at about 8, 10, 12, 14 months, relative to our age, we take on something that seems pretty scary at the time. We take a risk, and that risk is walking like we've seen all the big people do. Okay. If we just take this stage and that activity and a snapshot of that, do you believe when we start walking relative to our age, that's a big challenge for us and we might be a little more anxious? Who believes that? Relative to our age, we're 10, 12, 14 months, and we decide to take our hands, push ourselves up, that our anxiety's up a little while we take on that challenge of walking. The thing that we saw all these big people do around us that's really fast. All right, I'm seeing yes, yes, yes. Okay, good. All right, so we decide to take on this challenge, and we're going to test our resilience in this, and we start walking. So it's green, we're doing pretty good, and then we fall down. So this ugly little symbol here would be adversity. All right, does anybody know what we're going to do at that point? It's green, we're doing good, but then we fall down. We're a little more anxious. We're taking on this challenge. We're doing pretty good, but then we fall. Does anybody know what we might do at that point when we fall? We're going to check the chat. Okay, we're going to cry because it's going to startle us. And then we're going to look at that adult. All right. And as small as this seems, when we look at that adult, there's two reactions. Okay, I'm just going to put two reactions on the table. All right, one reaction is the adult panics, runs over and picks the child up and then says, I'm going to carry you the rest of the day. When that adult panics and we look at that child's face, what do we think that we're seeing that child's face? What do you guys think? So you guys said it. We fall down, then we're going to look at that adult, and then the adult panics. What do we see? What do we think we might see in that child's face? All right, fear. All right, which would be the flip side of what the way we so fear, anxiety. Fear would be in that anxiety spectrum. All right, then we get carried the rest of the day, and then we're fine. All right, so here's scenario number two. The child falls down, looks at the adult, and the adult goes, "Did you fall down?" Oh, get used to that because there are different versions in that life. Picks the child up. Let's say it's your child. Pat them on the bottom and say, you know what? We're going to keep practicing and keep this pushing because you can do it. Do we think that will reflect in the child in any way if it's handled in that way? Child falls down. Adult doesn't panic. Says, you know what? There'll be a different version of that in life. We're going to practice how to get back up right now. Pats them on the bottom and keeps them going. Encouragement. The adult isn't worried, so I don't need to be either. Okay. Okay, so now let's take both children in both responses. The first child, each time they fall down, the adult panics and then goes and picks them up. And then it's time number 10, okay, that they're practicing, and the adult's not right there, and the child falls down. What will the child do? It's time number 10, they're practicing, they fall down, and the adult is not right there to pick them up immediately. What's on the table for the child to do if their only experience has been cry and wait for someone to pick them up? All right. All right, let's take the second child. It's time number 10, and that adult said, oh, I'm going to help you, pat you on the bottom, and you're going to keep it going because I know you can do it. And time number 10 or 11, the adult's not right there, and then that child falls down. What's that child more likely to do? Get back up and try again, and it's uneventful. All right. So, why I use that as an example is that's something that's pretty low stakes, but it's very tangible and actionable and digestible to look at. What I say is to develop resilience in kids is to have some dance of that for whatever developmental stage in life. Okay. So, whatever the application of that is with spelling, whatever the application of that would be for enrichment, for math, when that child turns 15 and they start driving, there's like a sweet spot in a way to do that that's applicable to get that same sort of effect. Okay. As the child gets older, and we're going to talk about parenting styles in time number three. What I just described is more of an authoritative parenting style. So you got safety in place. We don't want the child falling downstairs. We're promoting their independence and supporting them to take on something new. And then we're not over supporting to where we have removed the ability for that child to grow or develop that resilience. All right. So as you think about older kids, what would be the version of that depending on the developmental stage? All right. The other thing would be, actual skills like these. So developing the ability for a child to think and then act, that really would be emotional intelligence, helping a child develop the skills to recognize an emotion and then regulate it. Right. I work with officers. They have a homework assignment where they have to bring, while they are on the clock in a given day in a stressful job, what are things that you're going to do throughout that day to have good recognition and regulate yourself before you go on calls. Okay. What that led to is Seattle police, through all the challenges last year in 2024, had the lowest unideal use of force in the country with an ability to do that. We all need that ability. Okay. The ability to advocate for oneself. All right. Whether it's children you work with or your own children, at some point they're going to be 18, 19, 20 years old, navigating the workplace or college or whatever else. A child that has developed the skill to advocate, when they run into adversity, they're much more likely to go knock on somebody's door and say, hey, you know what? I've had some falls in my life dating back to when I was 10 months old as that toddler. But when I fall down, I know how to get up. I'm knocking on this person's door and I'm asking for help. Okay. The ability to reflect, positive partnership would be developing skills for kids to be able to cooperate with each other, work on tasks together. What that gives them ability to do is at some point they're in a work meeting or a college course and they have the ability to navigate that with good skills because they've been learning that along the way, which leads to less frustration at that time. Okay. And then this stamina right here, I would say if we go back to the pandemic and maybe some adults, getting back to school or the workplace or whatever it is, those days felt a whole lot longer when you didn't have long stretches of time. That was a risk for frustration and other things. So, collectively, what I found in research is developing skills like this in kids and growing those skills over time leads to more resilience. All right. Okay. So, what I want you all to do, and we may have enough to do breakouts. Emily, are you still here? I think I'm going to try breakouts. I want you to think of a couple things. I want you to think of the child that's very resilient and doing well. Okay, so we've got a child that's just knocking out of the park, very resilient, doing very well. And I want you to make two lists in partners in a breakout group. It could just even be two people together, Emily. I want you to come up with a list of what might we see from that child, the resilient child that's doing great. And I mean attributes and adjectives. So that's list number one is attributes and adjectives that we'd see from the resilient, doing well child. And then list number two is to become that way, what do we believe was in place throughout their life? Okay. Let me see if I can, maybe I'll put that in the chat. But any questions just on face value of me just saying it? All right. So number one is, what would be the attributes of who the child who is very resilient and doing well? Just adjectives. They take on challenges, they keep moving forward in adversity, whatever those adjectives would be. And then the second one is, to become that way, what do we believe they had in place throughout their life to end up being what we could observe? Okay. All right. Any questions about that? All right. Let's do some pair ups and we'll do 6 minutes of that. Okay. 6 minutes. And then we'll talk about that list. All right. Thank you, everybody.
So I told her, I said, hey, you come out? I want to bus pick up her. I said, hey, Miss Lee really missed you a lot. Yeah, I'm so happy you are here in the morning. I said, I'm
All right. All right. Thanks for taking the time to hang out. Did anything come up in those conversations that we throw on that list of what might be attributes that we see from that resilient, happy, doing well kid? Is there anything that came up that we would be able to observe? If we were following a kid around all day, we'd go, oh, there's a sign there. Oh, there's a sign there. What types of things did you guys talk about that came up? Or you can just throw them in the chat too. All right, confidence and positivity. All right, good. They're engaged socially. They try new things, take on the challenge of new things. I often say. All right, they trust. Okay. Any other attributes we might see from that kid? I'm trying to picture them. Okay. They assume leadership. They don't mind stepping in front. They're perceptive of things. All right. Anything else you talked about? In my pairing, we talked some about they may have developed patience between wanting something and getting what they want. They've grown a little more resilient of being able to work for it or whatever else without getting that immediate gratification. And then they get it and they appreciate it. So we talked about that. All right. So that's what that child would look like. And then we talked about the child would be like maybe competent in certain areas. Let's say a child is really competent and end up extraordinary in an area. The question I often ask is, do we believe that child along the way had lots of setbacks along the way before they got there? And in most cases, they did have lots of setbacks, but they developed some ability to get up from those setbacks and continue to push forward, which led them to being very competent. Okay? All right, they can approach things more calmly. And what I would say about the way I would describe calmly is they might not be over anxious or have a nervous system that puts them in position to freeze up. They're approaching a challenge or whatever else, and they have more calm to them. All right. So then the second part of this is, and we don't need to do it in a breakout for the sake of time, but remember, maybe think about it and throw it in the chat. For this child to become this resilient, happy, doing well way, what do we believe they've had in place in their life to become this? Okay. All right, predictability and consistency. What else might this child have had in their life to become this resilient doing? All right, support and encouragement, a support system for when they encounter stress, loving adults, okay, positive interactions, a safe environment, some stress and support. All right, good. I'm gonna take these and present from what you all gave me. Yes, they have some stress in place, call that life, and then some support when stress happens in some way. All right, so with those in mind, and for the sake of time, you know, a lot of probably what you all said are on this slide here. All right, so then here would be my question. I'm going to take one of these and then show they're loved. Okay. All right, so if we go to all of those lists that you guys said, and what you see here from Seattle Public Schools is this was a 8 to 9 year research study we were doing on looking at resilience and adversity in students. if that competent, happy, resilient kid we removed completely from their whole life that they received messages that say they are capable, in what way might that impact them? Okay, we just remove that one thing. For that child, we go all the way back to infancy and they never received a message that said they're capable. How might that impact them? And would they change from that happy, confident, resilient child? What do you guys think about that? We're going to remove that one thing. That child has never heard a message that said they are capable. Will that impact them and in what ways? And you just throw it in the chat. Would likely affect everything. All right. Yeah, tell me more about that. If you don't mind, not going to be as happy, able to take on new things. More self-doubt, negative effect on confidence. All right. When I do this exercise in person, I actually put this up on a board and we cross one out. Negatively affecting feedback loops. Yeah, so a feedback loop would be if this child has more self-doubt, we'll probably experience that from them in the way they're interacting with the world, people, and whatever challenges in front of them. And if you take this child and put them side by side with that child that's doing pretty well, when they're in that way and we experience them in that way, the feedback loop is going to be there's going to be a response from the environment that impacts them differently than the other child. Okay, and for the sake of time, if we were doing this in person, what I'd say is these would be considered protective factors. When you remove one of these and we start thinking about the effects or impacts of it, these other things around them start dominoing and disappearing as well. Okay. And so there's not a magic wand to this. The foundation of resilience is having collectively a lot of these things in place. And like I said, even using myself as an example, when my father passed away, I was fortunate enough to have a lot of these things in place. Okay? And I can tell you, I have friends who lost parents that didn't have a lot of these things in place, and where we ended up in is significantly different places. And it's not because I was a better human being than them; it's because I was fortunate enough to have these things around me. Okay, which probably informs a lot of the work I do now, to be honest. All right, but yeah, if we really had the time, if we were sitting in person going through these, each time we remove one of these, there's a domino effect. And I'll tell you all, for those of you who may work in schools or the center, we could take this child that's confident, resilient, and happy and remove enough of these to where they become a very challenging child to deal with. Okay? So the line between that child who is presenting significant challenges, the line is not that wide between that child and the child that's doing great. All right. But this gives us something tangible that we could look at or focus on. All right. All right. So how would you define and describe the idea of resilience? And you could either say it out loud or put it in the chat, but what would be the definition of this word, do you think? Resilience.
I always like to say you can bend but not break.
Yeah, okay, that's a good analogy. You know, like the winds of whatever come through and it bends you a little bit but doesn't break you. All right, good. And then in the chat, able to thrive regardless of the conditions. Okay, good. Adjusting the sails and keep going. All right. So, and one of the blanket definitions that captures everything you all said is some positive adaptation in the face and following adversity. Okay, which would be that that sail or that bend that doesn't break would fall underneath that. All right. So what I say, if trust, here's those Erik Erikson terms. Trust is that line, that green line right there at the top. And what I say is we're on this trajectory of development. What adversity or challenges does is it has the impact of dropping you off this green line down to this red line for a moment. And it's at that point that as a child ages, the hope is they have recognition of that and have the skills to get themselves back up to this green line. And the other part of this is when they drop down to this red line, that they have enough protective factors, the best one being people, that could support them to get them back to this green line and moving forward. Okay. If we use the baby analogy relative to their age, they fall down to this red line. We give them a pat, say, you know what, there's a version of that in life, get them onto the green line, and they keep on moving forward. All right. And so I'm going to skip this one, but if we were to look at a slide like this, all right, and then there's that squiggly thing again is the adversity. And let's say the child runs into adversity number 1 to the left, and we were measuring their stress on that stress scale I showed earlier. There was like the ideal zone and the non-ideal zone. And they run into something that's very challenging and adverse, and they're very high on that stress scale, but they're supported, they develop some skills, and they get around it, and now they're on this right side of it where my arrow's moving, okay? And they run into it again. Do we believe their stress is lower this time? They've been supported, developed some skills, even though it was very challenging, and now they're on this side of it, and they run into it again. Okay. I'm seeing Emily say yes. Okay. All right. They're a little anxious about it. They're hoping all those things work again. They try it on and they don't just fall down and not get up, and they get to the other side of it and then they see it again. Do we think their stress is less this time than the other 2 times when they see it again? If they ran into it, got through it, used some skills, and now they're looking at it a 3rd time. Okay. How soon after do they encounter it again? Yeah, that's a good question, because I did say earlier repetition and time matter. All right, they get through it. They're seeing it a 4th time, they get through it. They see it a 5th time, they get through it, and they see it time number 10. Is it possible that if they keep getting through this, that at time number 10, they see it and there's not a second thought about it? They just do what they've done and they keep it pushing and it's uneventful. Is that possible at some point? And then all of a sudden we compare the first time to the 30th time. They see it, do what they need to do, move forward, and just keep pushing through their day. Is that possible? All right. What I'm seeing is yes, yes, yes. It becomes routine. Yes. All right. That right there would be your interplay of the science of and the action of resilience is this phenomena right here. Okay. And you could apply that to that baby that fell down. You could apply this to math. You could apply this to sports. But in some way, it's having the ability to get through these things with support. And then when you pull back all the support, somebody's just got it. This is it right here. Okay. But the thing is, those things have to be in place. All right. So, I already asked this within the other graphic. So here's how things play out. We've got a world around us. So this would be called nurture, this world around us. It's going to interplay with a child. We do have a temperament. Things like anxiety can be genetic. Okay. So that would be more nature. But this world around us, the protective factors, all the things we have are going to do some sort of interplay with our DNA, and it's going to kick out something over here. And what the research would say is if we have all those supports, all those things you said that competent, confident, resilient, happy kid has, if we can get those things in place, by the time you get to the end of this formula, that kid is right here in this optimal zone to be developing. Okay. All right, so we have this brain that's accumulating experiences. There's a risk that that brain could be very anxious, ready to freeze or flee or whatever else. But if we have all those protective factors in place, we can apply the things that we're learning. We actually reverse this. And this is what on-track development would look like. On-track development would be this. This is the ratios that we want right here. But it takes all those protective factors and everything else to get this brain. By the time we're into adulthood, we want this frontal lobe fully formed and functioning well. This is where your emotional intelligence is. This is where your resilience is this brain right here, which is the opposite of that, the big red dot. Okay. We still need this red dot for some things, but maturity, on-track development, and so on would be a health that confident, competent person is operating here. Okay. And then the resilient brain, is sorry, go to the slide for the sake of time. The resilient brain is here. Can you guys see that? Am I still screen sharing or not? I'm not. Okay, hold on. Here, let me go to a slide. Sorry. All right. Now am I screen sharing? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to show this, and I actually talk about this quite a bit with schools. What happened here? That was weird. All right, so we said earlier, many of you said a negative experience sticks with you more intently than a positive. And I've been using this term, past the positive. This is the catching the kid doing something well. Or if a child's not doing something well, check in with them, give them some feedback, be a safe, caring person with that feedback, and point them in the right direction to do it well by reinforcing that more positive behavior. Okay. The research used to say you need 5 positives to counter every 1 negative. And over the years, it's actually ticked up to 8 positives for every 1 negative. Okay. And then how does that add up? Let me ask you all. Here's a kid, and here's messages they've accumulated over time, right? So you see that number, 5,840,345, and those are the messages. And then outside of the circle, there's 458,000 total messages that say, I'm capable, cared about, the future is bright, people believe in me, I have successes. Okay. So here's a kid. What might we see from this child day to day? Okay. At home, at school, at enrichment. This kid's brain data, emotional data, experiential data are these numbers. What might we see from this child, do you think? At these ratios. All right, in the chat, they're not going to try anymore. What's the point? Yep, they could be on their phone all the time scrolling. Okay. Anything else? What would their affect be? What would their demeanor be? Would they be happy? Would they be more down? Flat affect? Okay. All right. So I'm gonna change one variable on the next slide. And I'm wondering from you all, just changing this one over. Yeah, aggressive could be, honestly. And I don't know if you all know, but like some people think that if your affect is flatter or you're more depressed, that you're just down and in the dumps. But the irritability, especially in adolescent teenage years, irritability could be a symptom of being down or more flat and just not happy. Okay. All right. So if you look at this slide, I'm going to just switch one thing. All I did was reverse the count on the messages. So the messages are identically the same. They didn't change, but the number flip-flopped. Would we experience this child significantly different by just doing that? By just flip-flopping the count, is this child significantly different now? All right, I'm seeing yes. Okay. All right, does that seem actionable to do that? Or does that seem like a huge haul? And there's still some red here because, I do believe that, hey, if a child is on the wrong track doing something, then you want to positively shape their behavior to do the correct thing. Oh, yeah. All right. Good. Yeah, that's some quick math there. The ratio is about 10 to 1. All right. That's great. Thank you. All right. But yeah, hey, when I work with kids, and I've worked with a ton, been involved with a lot of cases, I do rewinds with kids. Hey, let's try that again. So here's what we did. Here's the situation. How could we make this better for yourself in the situation? So what I'm doing in that is I'm supporting and helping be that child's prefrontal cortex to shape that thinking and that behavior to be more ideal. All right. And what that does is it creates ratios like this. All right. And so here's that brain developing, everyone. This is a snapshot of neurons developing over time. So what you'll see here is these hours are ticking in this lower right. That's how much this brain is changing, accumulating that information. Okay. What I tell people is this could be green or red depending on what these messages are. And then when you flip this on the side, here is a person or a child, and these dots are experiences accumulating. If the protective factors aren't placed and the messages aren't ideal and you accumulate too much in the red, now this child is at risk of experiencing what you'd call anticipatory stress. They're in a state of just avoiding anything that could add on. They're not going to be very resilient. Okay. If we take those messages, this is what those messages would look like if we flipped it on its side and put real neurons or memories to it. What you got to do is get that to be more like this. Okay. And then there's going to be a day where a child or a student or your own child is going to say, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to take it on and just see. And when they're successful at it, it creates a big dot up here like this. Okay. And then they're more likely to give something else a shot at some point. They're going to be unsure if they can do it, but they're going to take it on and they're going to try it. And it's going to create another big dot like that. What I'm showing you all is these big red dots. If these were on the bottom side of this, those would be traumatic events. But if you can put enough in what I would call tier 1 and build that base of those protective factors, now you've got extreme positive. Do you believe this child's going to be much more resilient? The last thing I'll say too is if this child here does experience something traumatic, a big red dot down here, it won't completely devastate them because in the broader aggregate and counts of everything ideal versus non-ideal, that's going to feel like an anomaly. All of this up here is going to carry them through still. Okay. And that person's going to remain pretty resilient. All right. So thanks for joining tonight, everybody. That time probably went by fast. There's two more of these. The next one, I'm going to really start dialing in on like what type of parenting styles lends itself more to this. And then number 4 will be taking the 3 sessions and kind of putting them all together. And so we're halfway through. But before we head out, are there any questions, thoughts, or anything? I try not to throw too much information at folks in a short period of time, but hopefully it was digestible and there you got something you could take. Thanks for all your participation too. I appreciate all that. But any other last minute questions or thoughts before we head out? All right, yeah, you're welcome, everybody. So it's looking like we do these every other month. So I may not see you all next month, but I think the next one will be in January. So, but if there's questions or anything that come up, maybe email Hilltop, and then if they shoot them my way, I'll take the time to think about them. Okay. All right. So appreciate you all joining, and I won't see you, but have a happy holidays and so on before I see you again. All right. Take care. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Emily, for your help.
You made a great cookie.
What's that?
Sorry, that was the person in the room with me.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. All right.
All right, are you good, David? You need anything?
No, thank you for all your help.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. I think it seemed like people got a lot out of it. So thank you.
All right. Take
And
care.
We'll hope for more folks next time.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Let's do it in person next time. I appreciate